had information. Reports existed. Cases were built. Warnings were filed. Evidence accumulated. The machine of knowledge was working. What failed was not intelligence. What failed was political will, or perhaps more accurately, political morality. Again and again, the decision was made that other objectives mattered more. Regional power mattered more. Covert leverage mattered more. Strategic flexibility mattered more. Congressional exposure had to be avoided. Sensitive channels had to stay alive. Embarrassment had to be delayed. And every time that calculation was made, somebody else paid for it. A murdered dissident. Communities flooded by narcotics. A society bent under dictatorship. Civilians buried beneath the correction phase of a problem that had been tolerated for years. That is the real architecture of impunity. Not merely protecting a criminal, but distributing the cost of that protection onto people with no voice in the decision. Conclusion: the monster they managed until they couldn't. The most unsettling part of the Noriega story is that it does not fit the comforting language of failure. This was not a case where agencies simply did not know enough. It was not a case where nobody saw the danger. It was not a case of one accidental misjudgment. It was a long sequence of informed accommodations. Manuel Noriega was ambitious, manipulative, and brutal on his own. The United States did not invent those traits, but it helped build the structure in which those traits could scale. It offered money, access, training, insulation, and years of tolerance. It kept using him after the evidence darkened. It kept calculating after the moral line should have broken. And when the relationship finally ended, it ended through force so vast that ordinary Panamanians absorbed much of the final shock. That is why the story endures. Because it is not only about one dictator in one country during one decade of the Cold War. It is about a recurring temptation in statecraft. The belief that dangerous men can be controlled indefinitely if they remain useful enough. The belief that secrecy can contain corruption. The belief that strategic necessity cancels moral debt. For a while, those beliefs can look efficient. Then one day the asset becomes a liability. The secret becomes a scandal. The client becomes a witness. And the government that once protected him arrives with soldiers, lawyers, and a public explanation prepared for television. By then, the truth is already buried under years of silence. And somewhere in the ruins, the people who never approved any of it are left to live with what remains. Washington, D.C., a federal building, bright lights, press cameras, men in suits, agents in dress uniforms. In that room, applause breaks out. At the front stands a man wearing a uniform and a calm, unreadable expression. His name is Manuel Noriega. To the people clapping, this looks like diplomacy, maybe even partnership. A useful foreign strongman being rewarded for helping the United States in a dangerous region. But beneath that ceremony is a truth, so dark it sounds invented. Because while officials smile for the cameras, Panama is becoming one of the most important hidden corridors in the global cocaine trade. Millions are moving, then hundreds of millions, then billions. Drug money is washing through Panamanian banks. Planes are crossing jungle routes. Protection is being sold. Laboratories are operating under armed guard. And the man standing at the podium is not outside that system. He is sitting at its center. That is what makes the scene unforgettable. The institution supposedly fighting narcotics is publicly honoring a man accused of helping move them. And even that contradiction is only the surface. For years, Noriega had been more than a foreign ruler. He had been a U.S. intelligence asset. He had relationships with powerful people in Washington. He had access to covert networks, regional secrets, anti-communist operations, and shadow diplomacy stretching across Latin America. He was useful, and in the Cold War, usefulness could buy silence. So for more than 2 decades, one extraordinary arrangement survived. A man accused of political terror, corruption, murder, and narcotics trafficking remained protected because too many powerful interests believed they still needed him, until they didn't. And when that protection finally collapsed, it did not end with a resignation, a diplomatic cable, or a quiet arrest. It ended with an invasion, tens of thousands of American troops, airstrikes, urban combat, entire neighborhoods turned to ash, civilians trapped between a dictator who had outlived his purpose and a superpower that decided the bill had finally come due. This is not just a story of Manuel Noriega. It is a story of how intelligence relationships become addictions, how governments convince themselves they are managing monsters, right up until the moment those monsters become too expensive to keep alive, and how the people who pay the highest price are almost never the men who made the decisions. To understand Noriega, you have to understand Panama. Panama was never just a small country on the map. It was a pressure point of global power. The canal made it strategically priceless. Whoever influenced Panama influenced shipping, military movement, commercial access, and regional leverage. For Washington, that made Panama too important to leave to uncertainty. In the 1960s and 1970s, the United States was obsessed with one question in Latin America: who might fall into Cuba's orbit next? Revolutions, guerrilla movements, leftist parties, armed factions, student groups, labor networks. All of it was monitored through the Cold War lens. In Washington, many policymakers didn't see a spectrum of local political struggles. They saw a map where influence could spread like fire. What they needed in Panama was not a public ally, but a dependable insider, someone inside the military structure, someone ambitious, someone who would trade loyalty for access and money. They found that man young. Manuel Antonio Noriega did not look like history would bend around him. He was not charismatic in the traditional sense. He was not a mass orator. He did not inspire through charm. What he possessed instead was something colder and, in many ways, more dangerous: discipline, patience, ambition, and a deep instinct for leverage. He understood early that information is power, not slogans, not flags, not even ideology. Information, the right secret in the right moment, could buy money, protection, promotion, and survival. Once he learned that lesson, he built his life around it. By the late 1960s, he was already in contact with American intelligence. What began as recruitment became a relationship. What began as a source became an asset. And what looked like a manageable arrangement slowly turned into one of the most expensive bargains Washington would ever make in the region. In his early rise, Noriega fit the profile intelligence agencies often value most: useful, local, hard-edged, and morally flexible. He advanced through the Panamanian military system during a period when military institutions across Latin America were not simply national defense structures. They were political engines. To control intelligence inside such a system was to hold the nervous system of the state. Noriega proved very good at that game. He collected files. He tracked rivals. He built networks. He studied who feared what, who wanted what, who could be bought, and who needed to disappear. The more he learned, the more valuable he became to both his domestic superiors and his foreign handlers. American officials saw in him a stream of intelligence: reports on leftist actors, regional contacts, internal tensions, strategic signals. He was close enough to power to be useful, but at first not powerful enough to be dangerous. That illusion did not last. As he rose through Panama's intelligence ranks under Omar Torrijos, he became increasingly central to how information moved through the state. The Americans knew he was ruthless. Reports tied his circles to intimidation, repression, and brutality. But usefulness kept defeating caution. That is one of the recurring patterns in this entire story. Warning signs were not missed. They were absorbed and tolerated. This was not blindness. It was choice. The more years passed, the more Noriega became embedded in a system where secrets worked like currency. He gained access not only to Panamanian power structures, but to methods, assumptions, and vulnerabilities inside the American intelligence relationship itself. He learned what mattered to Washington. He learned what they feared. He learned the difference between scandal and intolerable scandal. And that distinction gave him room to grow. Then came the death of Omar Torrijos in 1981. The Panamanian strongman whose aircraft went down in a crash that has remained surrounded by suspicion and unanswered questions. Whether by planning, luck, or ruthless positioning, Noriega emerged from the political aftermath stronger than anyone else. Rivals were pushed aside. Competitors weakened. Internal resistance neutralized. Within a relatively short period, the intelligence asset was no longer just whispering into power. He was becoming power. Chapter 3. From Informant to Ruler. By the early 1980s, Noriega was effectively the dominant force in Panama. That changed everything. A source can be pressured. A military ruler with intelligence files, armed loyalists, foreign connections, and a national apparatus behind him is something else entirely. For Washington, this should have been the moment of alarm. Instead, it became the moment of deeper dependency. Cold War officials often made peace with ugly partners if those partners delivered strategic advantage. A dictator who aligned with U.S. regional priorities could be tolerated more easily than a democratic outcome that created uncertainty. In that logic, Noriega did not become less attractive as he consolidated power. In some ways, he became more attractive. He ran the security machine. He influenced the banks. He sat at the geographic crossroads between South America and Central America. He occupied a country that was both strategically vital and logistically valuable. If you were designing covert routes, secret channels, financial buffers, or deniable operations, Panama was useful. And if Panama was useful, Noriega was unavoidable. At exactly the same time, Colombia's cocaine empires were evolving. The trafficking routes that had once run more simply through the Caribbean were becoming riskier. Enforcement pressure was increasing. Interdiction efforts were tightening. Smugglers needed flexible transit points, laundering channels, air access, protection, documents, safe houses, and political insulation. Panama offered all of it, and Noriega understood the opportunity immediately. He was never the kind of man to choose one buyer if he could sell to three. That was the genius and the fatal instability of his model. He was not serving a cause. He was monetizing access. American intelligence wanted regional leverage. Drug traffickers wanted corridors and protection. Cuban intelligence wanted information. Noriega discovered he could profit from all of them at once. That made him valuable. It also made him radioactive. As the Medellin cartel expanded, Panama became more than a convenient stop. It became infrastructure. Money could move through banks. Aircraft could cross remote zones. Officials could be managed. Documentation could be altered. Safe passage could be bought. Underworld logistics and state power began to overlap. That overlap is where Noriega thrived. Accounts from investigators, defectors, and later prosecutions painted a picture of a system in which protection was sold at multiple levels. Fees could be taken for transit. Commissions could be earned from laundering. High-value fugitives could be sheltered. Weapons of bureaucracy, passports, papers, permissions, silence, could be converted into profit. This was not street crime. It was state-enabled criminal architecture. And still, the relationship with Washington did not immediately collapse. That is what makes the story so disturbing. The allegations were not minor. They touched narcotics routes, dirty money, violent enforcement, and deeper regional corruption. Yet again and again, the machinery of consequence slowed, softened, or stopped. Investigators in one corner would build cases. Reports in another corner would document abuse. Witnesses would identify routes, names, accounts, locations. Then some higher consideration, national security, regional stability, sensitive equities, whatever phrase the era preferred, would descend and the pressure would ease. The message to Noriega was devastatingly clear. You are protected beyond ordinary law. And once a ruler received that message often enough, he stops behaving like a client. He starts behaving like a man who thinks the system belongs to him too. Sometimes history offers a moment so brutal, so undeniable, that any government serious about principle should be forced to act. For Noriega, one of those moments came with the killing of Hugo Spadafora. Spadafora was not just another opponent. He was outspoken, courageous, politically engaged, and increasingly dangerous to Noriega because he was gathering evidence. He intended to expose what others had only whispered: the corruption, the trafficking links, the criminal ties, the rot. He crossed into Panama, knowing the risk. He did not leave alive. He was seized, tortured, and murdered. His body was found in a horrifying state. A killing so savage it carried a message beyond the victim himself. This was not merely elimination. It was intimidation through spectacle. And the people who mattered in Washington knew. Reports moved. Assessments were filed. The information existed. Yet once again, no decisive break followed immediately. No immediate moral line appeared. No instant collapse of the relationship. The same cold calculation remained in place, however ugly Noriega was. He was still entangled with operations and interests too sensitive to disrupt lightly. That is one of the central moral indictments of this story. Not that institutions lacked evidence. Not that they were confused. Not that they had no idea who Noriega was. It is that they knew enough and continued anyway. Spatafora's murder revealed something bigger than Noriega's cruelty. It revealed the elasticity of official outrage. Some crimes trigger rupture. Others are absorbed if the perpetrator remains strategically useful. That is how impunity hardens. A man does not become untouchable because no one knows what he has done. He becomes untouchable because too many people know, and fear what will unravel if they act. Chapter 6. Iran-Contra and the Secret Shield. Then came the layer that made the entire relationship even more dangerous. Covert operations tied Nicaragua and Iran-Contra era. Congress had attempted to limit direct U.S. support for the Contras. But where formal policy closes one door, covert operators often begin looking for another. Money needed routes. Weapons needed channels. Training needed deniable ground. Transactions needed distance from official fingerprints. Panama was perfect, a sovereign country functioning as a buffer, banks capable of concealment, airstrips capable of dual use, a strong man willing to cooperate for a price. This is where the Noriega problem became almost impossible to resolve cleanly. He was not merely a corrupt foreign ruler anymore. He was interwoven with activities that powerful American figures had extraordinary reasons to keep hidden, limited, or deniable. That changed the cost of confronting him. Removing Noriega too early did not simply risk embarrassment. It threatened exposure. Questions could be asked in Congress. Documents might be connected. Financial trails might be traced. Witnesses might speak. An intelligence asset who knows your secrets is never just a partner. He is also a future liability. And Noriega knew it. He understood that his greatest protection was no longer Panama's military or Panama's banks. It was a knowledge locked in his memory, who had visited, who had approved, who had tolerated, who had used him, who had looked away. That meant every year he remained in power, the relationship became harder to unwind. The Americans needed him less than before, perhaps, but feared him more. And fear can preserve alliances long after trust has died. Chapter 7. The press breaks the silence. The shield did not hold forever. By the mid-1980s, public reporting and political scrutiny began tearing holes in the cover. Investigative journalism pushed allegations into the open. Congressional inquiry deepened. Witnesses emerged. Financial records surfaced. Testimony accumulated. Once that process began, the old formula started to fail. Behind closed doors, a compromise with Noriega might still have seemed possible. In public, it became harder to defend. The same man once treated as useful intelligence property was now becoming a symbol of everything rotten about covert policy, anti-drug hypocrisy, and Cold War cynicism in the hemisphere. What had once been manageable secrecy became a reputational emergency. And that is another turning point worth noticing. States often endure corruption quietly until exposure changes the political price. The facts alone are not always enough. Sometimes what matters is that the facts become impossible to contain. Cases built by investigators started gaining momentum. Prosecutors moved. A federal indictment eventually arrived. Drug trafficking, racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy. This was historic and absurd at the same time. A man who had spent years inside sensitive relationships with the United States was now being treated as a criminal defendant by that same government. The mask had come off. The alliance had soured. The asset had become evidence. But Noriega still was not finished. Even after indictment, Noriega did not behave like a man preparing to disappear. He rigged elections. He used force. Opposition figures were beaten. Public intimidation escalated. The world watched images of violence in Panama and began to understand that this was not just a shadowy intelligence scandal. It was now an open confrontation with a dictator who believed he could outlast pressure. And for a while, he may have been right. Sanctions hurt Panama's economy, but they did not instantly remove him. Diplomatic condemnation increased, but he still controlled guns, institutions, and fear. He had survived so many previous scandals that it was rational for him to assume this one too might be survivable. He had another reason for confidence. He knew too much. A cornered dictator can be dangerous. A cornered dictator who has spent decades inside other people's secrets is dangerous in a different way. He does not just threaten violence. He threatens disclosure. If he fell uncontrollably, what might he reveal? Which covert routes? Which meetings? Which arrangements? Which tolerances? Which American officials had spoken with him, relied on him, excused him, or used him? This is why the final stage of the Noriega saga was never only about narcotics or dictatorship. It was also about containment. His downfall had to happen in a way that limited what came out with him. Chapter 9, the incident that changed the calculation. By late 1989, tensions between Panama and the United States were spiraling. Encounters between American service members and Panamanian forces grew more dangerous. The atmosphere was no longer merely hostile. It was unstable. Then came the incident that changed the equation. An American officer was killed at a checkpoint. Another U.S. officer and his wife were detained, abused, and terrorized. Those events struck Washington with a different kind of force. What years of intelligence warnings, trafficking allegations, and political crimes have failed to produce, a direct assault involving Americans now accelerated. Public justification hardened. Military options moved to the front. The cost-benefit analysis flipped. Keeping Noriega had once seemed useful. Now removing him seemed necessary. Officially, the reason centered on protecting American lives, defending treaty obligations, restoring democracy, and bringing a criminal to justice. Unofficially, there was another logic beneath the surface. A controlled operation was safer than an uncontrolled unraveling. If Noriega stayed loose, fled, or tried to bargain with hostile governments, he could weaponize memory. He could trade secrets. He could embarrass powerful institutions. He could turn survival into disclosure. A military operation followed by a managed legal process inside the United States offered a more secure outcome. Not clean, not moral, but controlled. And control is often what states value most at the end of compromised relationships. In December 1989, the United States launched Operation Just Cause. The scale was overwhelming. American troops struck multiple targets across Panama in rapid succession. Special operations units, infantry, airborne forces, aviation assets. It was a full-spectrum operation aimed at crushing organized resistance before it could properly form. For the Pentagon, it was a mission of compression and dominance. For Panamanians on the ground, especially civilians in dense urban areas, it was terror. Noriega's headquarters stood in and around populated neighborhoods, including El Chorrillo, where families lived in tightly packed housing. Once heavy firepower entered that environment, destruction spread far beyond military compounds. Buildings burned. Streets collapsed into chaos. People fled, hid, or died. Some estimates of civilian casualties remained relatively low in official counts. Others, from local and independent sources, place them far higher. What is beyond dispute is that an enormous number of ordinary people paid the price. Homes vanished. Communities were shattered. Survivors returned to ruins. This is one of the hardest truths in the entire story. When great powers decide to correct years of tolerated corruption through sudden force, the dead are rarely the men who designed the arrangement. Noriega was a target, yes, but whole neighborhoods became part of the invoice. Chapter 11, The Final Days of Protected Man. As Panama burned, Noriega did not die in a bunker or fall in a glorious last stand. He ran. He moved through safe houses, trying to stay ahead of forces that now seemed impossible to escape. The network that had once protected him was collapsing. Men who had followed him were suddenly liabilities or ghosts. The architecture of fear that sustained him no longer guaranteed refuge. Finally, he made one last move that perfectly captured the strange intelligence logic of his life. He sought sanctuary in the Vatican's diplomatic mission. It was a desperate act, but also an intelligent one. He understood symbolism. He understood legal complication. He understood that even overwhelming military power can be slowed by diplomatic boundaries. U.S. forces surrounded the mission but could not simply storm inside. So the standoff became surreal. Loud music, psychological pressure, a waiting game. A dictator once courted by major intelligence actors, now trapped behind diplomatic walls, reduced from protected operator to hunted relic. Eventually, the message reached him clearly. No permanent escape was coming. When he finally surrendered, he did so not as a triumphant strongman, but as a man whose value had expired. That may be the coldest sentence in this entire story. His crimes had not suddenly become real. They had been real for years. His danger had not suddenly appeared. It had been growing for decades. What changed was his utility. Once the balance tipped, the protection evaporated. In the United States, Noriega faced trial on charges tied to narcotics trafficking and corruption. Prosecutors presented money trails, testimony, cartel links, and evidence of illicit wealth on a scale impossible to explain away as rumor. He was convicted. From a legal standpoint, it looked like accountability. A former ruler, once feared and shielded, was now a prisoner in federal custody. Later came extraditions, more proceedings, more convictions, including accountability in Panama for the murder of Hugo Spadafora. And yet, even at the moment of conviction, the larger story remained incomplete. Noriega was punished. But what about the ecosystem that made him possible? What about the intelligence officers who continued relationships despite warning after warning? What about the officials who helped suppress investigations? What about the policymakers who decided some crimes could be tolerated in exchange for strategic convenience? What about the covert architecture that treated a criminal ruler as an acceptable instrument until he became embarrassing? Those people did not stand before juries in the same way. That is why the Noriega story resists simple endings. It is not the tale of one bad dictator finally defeated by law. It is the tale of the system that protected him, used him, then isolated him once the public cost became unbearable. He was not the only author of the disaster. He was the most visible one. If you want to measure the true cost of Noriega's rise and fall, don't start with Swiss accounts, military budgets, or sentencing years. Start with the neighborhoods. Start with the families who had nothing to do with intelligence deals, cocaine routes, covert logistics, diplomatic games, or anti-communist strategy. Start with the people who lived near the fire zones, the people displaced, the people buried, the people who returned to streets reduced to outline and ash. Start with the victims who were never in a room when officials made their calculations, because that is what the story ultimately exposed.